To this Human Rights Council, the 47th session side event on an avenue to justice for the 4th of August Beirut explosion. My name is Antonia Mulvey. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Executive Director of Legal Action Worldwide. We're a non-profit organisation that works in the Middle East, Africa and South Asia, providing legal assistance and representation for those who suffered from human rights violations and abuses. And we have a big team working in Lebanon, and we've been advising a group of victims from the 4th of August Beirut explosion. I want to thank a big thank you to our co-hosts, Human Rights Watch, who we've organised this event with today. And many of you may remember that we had a previous event earlier in March this year, and this is following on from that event as well. But most importantly, I want to welcome those who are affected by the 4th of August Beirut explosion. And I know many of you may have joined us today, or family members were affected. We're very honoured to have a very distinguished panel here today. We have Ambassador Kindle, who's the German ambassador to Lebanon, Sarah Copland, who's the mother of Isaac Ola, who's 2 years old and who died in the explosion. We have the friends of Elias Houri, who's 15 years old when he died in the explosion. Nadine Labake, who probably needs no introduction to you, director, actress, and activist. Nima Luth, who's the Middle East director for Amnesty International. Ayman Mahana, who's the executive director of the Samir Kassir Foundation. And Lama Thacker, who's the Crisis and Conflict Director of Human Rights Watch. So warm welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. Now, as I've mentioned, this panel is to focus on looking at the Human Rights Council as an avenue for justice for the victims and those who are affected. Before I talk a little bit about that and hand over to the ambassador to make some opening remarks, I want to take us back a little bit to what happened last year. I know for many of you it needs no reminder, but I just want to talk about the gravity of the situation and why we wanted to have, again, this panel event and the Human Rights Council for Justice. More than 200 people were killed, more than 7,000 were wounded, 77,000 apartments, houses were damaged, 300,000 people were forcibly displaced, and according to the World Bank, nearly it's 3.8 billion to 4.6 billion in material damage. Now, following the explosion last year, the Lebanese authorities made a commitment to investigate the situation, and since then, we can only state that there has been obstruction, delays, that look at what has happened. There has been 37 individuals who have been charged, but there have been no indictments. Those who have been charged are many low-ranking port, customs, security officials. Investigative Judge Sawan charged 3 former ministers and former caretaker prime minister. You may remember that they failed and refused to appear for questioning. It was argued that they had immunity, and that has been upheld. So to date, no one has been brought in at a senior level for questioning and for investigation. We should also note that this case has been put before the Judicial Council. It's an exceptional court with no right of appeal. The investigation is ongoing. Of course, as you know, in August, it will have been nearly 1 year. So why are we looking to the Human Rights Council? What is it? I just want to set it up very quickly in brief for those of you who may not be familiar with the UN Human Rights Council. It sits in Geneva. It comprises of 47 member states. We're requesting for member states to table a resolution. That means to make a request to have an independent investigation, which would be by UN investigators. In order for that to pass at the Human Rights Council, 24 of those 47 member states must vote for that. Please note the Human Rights Council is now sitting. We hope that a resolution will be tabled for September's Human Rights Council session. The Council sits 3 times a year. You might also ask the question, and we're going to come up a little bit later, why the Human Rights Council? What is it that really their mandate? And we would say, yes, it absolutely is. It is fundamentally the right of life, the right to protection before the law, the right to a remedy. And we hear from the victims and their families today. Right to education, the right to health. Lebanon has multiple crises ongoing at the moment. I don't need to tell many of you that. But when we have been speaking about this situation, many times we have been told, you have to understand there's a political crisis, there's an economic crisis, massive inflation in Lebanon. But we say to you, and we ask you to pass this message on, there's also a crisis of accountability. For decades, there has been impunity, a culture of impunity. And if we don't address that, the vacuum of the rule of law, how can we build the Lebanon that we want? And I spent many years living in Lebanon. It's very close to our heart. We must address this fundamental issue, and we must address it in relation to the Beirut explosion, because we're looking at back to decades where individuals have not been held to account at the very highest level. That's why we're here today. And we're going to hear from the victims themselves why they want this. So thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Kindle, the German ambassador to Lebanon. Thank you so much for joining us and for your support. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Antonia, for inviting me to this discussion on the occasion of the 47th session of the Human Rights Council. I feel humbled by being alongside with strong survivors like Sarah, friends of Elias, and experts on the panel. I want to thank Legal Action Worldwide and Human Rights Watch for organizing this site event, because it contributes to not forgetting by publicly discussing what happened in last August. I want to convey my personal heartfelt condolences to all of those who lost loved ones in the blast. And as representatives, Sarah here, and Mario and Hugo and Elias' friends. I had arrived in Beirut exactly a week before the blast, and on the 4th of August, 7 minutes after 6 o'clock in the afternoon, I was with my family in Hotel Phoenicia, which was completely destroyed. We had no, we were lucky. Others were not. A colleague of mine, Gabriele, was killed instantly in the blast. And of course, for the survivors, life changed dramatically at that moment. Opening today's discussion, I just want to make a few remarks, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. One is on the legal system. Antonia, you mentioned this. One of the last decisions of the Diab government on the 10th of August, just before resigning, they referred the investigation into the causes of the explosion from a military court to a civilian court, which allows at least a public trial. The investigation, as I understand it, has to be secret according to the Code of Criminal Procedure. And considering the character and the size of the catastrophe, a long investigation can be expected. I had talks with both judges, Fadi Sawan and Tariq Bitar, and my understanding is the judge, Tariq Bitar, is planning to finish his investigation by the end of this year. Unfortunately, a lot of what we know so far about the investigation does not encourage us to believe that our demands for and hopes of an impartial, credible, independent, fair, and transparent investigation, as we said, will be fulfilled. Neither Fadi Sawan nor Tariq Bitar have the appropriate means and resources provided in order to be able to master this challenge. There has been conflict of interest. There has been double standards in arresting and interrogating some, but not others. There has been lack of independence of the judiciary, and there has been heavy political threatening and undue influence. All of this fits into the picture of the Lebanese judiciary. Best intentions of a few, thwarted by the unwavering will of survival of a corrupt political system with disregard for the separation of powers and celebrating a culture of impunity. A remark on the political system. The explosion was caused at least by criminal negligence and criminal mismanagement by government authorities over a long period of time. Maybe by other actors as well, maybe worse. You would expect that such a catastrophe is cathartic or catalytic enough for even a stable regime to crumble and fall. You would expect that at least a hint of empathy, a touch of self-reflection, an official minute of silence, a day of mourning, a respectful visit to the families of the victims. You would expect that people in charge immediately draw conclusions from past mistakes and try to prevent similar incidents from happening again. No, nothing of this. A whole political class, fully responsible for the mess of several decades, not in any way fulfilling any of the people's expectations, went into hiding, covering for each other. For decades, a group of individuals lived on corruption and misappropriation of state funds, feeding into a quasi-feudal system. It's obvious to me that many people profited from this, but the overall population has to bear the consequences of that nepotism and clientelism. What happened in the port is a paradigm for that. During 7 years, again and again, honest public servants took Articles 398 and 399 of the Penal Code for serious. If you become aware of a crime, you must alert the public authorities. But it seems that their superiors were not necessarily interested in the warning. Through the political stagnation, as I understand it, there's another risk for the investigation. At the moment, there's no quorum in the higher judicial council, and therefore no possibility of appointing a successor to Tariq Bitar if he had to discontinue his mission. The investigation would be over. So a few points on what can be done to bring about justice. National jurisdiction is the primary sovereign response. And in the EU Human Rights and Democracy Country Strategy 2021, the first priority of action is the right to justice and accountability, including the independence of the judiciary, promoting accountability and access to justice, fight against corruption and impunity. The investigation deserves close monitoring while it is ongoing and expertise review when it is finished. The public trial must be accompanied by national and international observers. Those who engage themselves in a critical appraisal deserve support. The indictments to be expected from Judge Tariq Bitar are possibly not the last ones presented. It is old wisdom that the judiciary is in practice largely not independent. For 2.5 years now, reform legislation is in the making. The draft bill in Parliament does indeed include elements of increased independence, for instance, concerning the higher judicial council, but then again, full dependence on government and political parties concerning the judicial inspection authority. So this is a mixed picture. My impression is that these legislative proposals need more public debate, and maybe we diplomats also need to be more outspoken in public about this. The international community has been supportive of judicial reform and has financed many projects with very little success so far. This is a slow process, I know, and we need patience, but we also need to be smarter about this. Germany has a focus on the legal system and is planning to work among others, with legal action worldwide on accountability and access to justice in Lebanon. It is not meant to be cheap whataboutism when I say that the misery of the legal system is part of a larger problem. The asphyxiation, in fact, occupation of the state and its institutions by the political class. That problem needs to be dealt with, and the international community has in the past not been innocent as it poured more money into the country in exchange for empty promises, thereby contributing to a stabilization of the system. This time, the international community is committed more than before to contributing to implementing reforms, those forces that seek to build Lebanon back better, that want to restore accountability, responsibility, and transparency, can count on our support. Essentially, what I'm meaning to say is that to bring about justice means to bring about change. I know that little what I said can mitigate the frustration of us all, and I'm afraid I've taken more time than was allotted to me already. Thank you for inviting me, Antonia, for this discussion, and I'm looking forward for the debate afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Kindle. I must say your words really resonated with me, and I'm sure with everybody listening to you. They were so powerful. I heard you said about the ruling elite, the political elite, they went into hiding, covering for each other. It's the overall civilian population as well that has paid the price in the past, I would argue, and will continue to pay the price unless we bring about change. And I think that's why we're all here as well. And we really thank you for your support and those powerful words that you said. Now I'd like to turn to Sarah. Sarah, I've got to know Sarah over the last few months. It's so good to see you, Sarah. It's very late for her. Sarah, over to you. Good to see you again.
Thank you, Antonia. And I'd like to start by thanking Legal Action Worldwide and Human Rights Watch for hosting this important event and for working tirelessly to obtain justice for the victims and survivors of the atrocity that was the Beirut blast. As Antonia said, we've gotten to know each other quite well over the last few months, and Antonia is just non-stop, and it just means so much to us. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about Isaac, what happened to him and the impact that his death has had on our family. At 2 years old, Isaac was the youngest victim of the Beirut blast. He was an outgoing, confident, brave, and incredibly intelligent and affectionate little boy. Isaac constantly astounded my husband and I with his fierce intelligence, and we knew from very early on that he had more potential than the two of us combined. He was a master at puzzles and was quickly picking up Arabic and French, despite the fact that my husband and I are fluent in neither. And at 2 years old, could already count to 25 in French, a feat that astounded his teachers at his beloved daycare. And the fact is, he was thriving in Beirut. He was extremely outgoing, and as we walked around the city, he would wave at the locals, many of whom would stop and have a chat with him, which he loved. Isaac had endless energy. During the COVID lockdown, when he couldn't go to the park or daycare, he loved tearing around our oversized Beirut apartment on his scooter, deftly maneuvering around the corners and dodging furniture before purposely crashing into a wall. When he wasn't on his scooter, he was dancing along to his favorite songs, or seeking to take on his dad in a pretend lightsaber duel, running around shouting "Zoom, zoom" as they battled. But above all, Isaac was loving and affectionate. Often he would just suddenly stop whatever he was playing, come over and give me a really big hug, and then just go back to his game. I feel a physical pain at the thought that I'll never receive one of his hugs again. Now let me tell you how this beautiful little boy was killed. Isaac was sitting in his high chair having dinner at home, in the place where he should have been the most safe, singing along to his favorite nursery rhymes when the explosion hit. I was thrown to the ground, but Isaac in his high chair was like a sitting target. A large piece of glass pierced his tiny chest. Not knowing what happened, my husband and I raced to get help, but the closest hospital, St. George, had been destroyed in the blast. A good Samaritan, who I flagged down on the street, raced us to Rafiq Hariri Hospital, where Isaac died shortly afterwards. The glass had pierced his heart and his lungs, and he died of massive internal bleeding and cardiac arrest. I was almost 7 months pregnant at the time, and we were just 3 weeks away from leaving Lebanon to return to Australia to have the baby. Instead of taking Isaac home to see his grandparents and cousins and to meet his new baby brother, we had to accompany his casket back to Australia. I have struggled to come to terms with what happened to Isaac, not only because losing a child is the worst pain imaginable, but also because of how it happened. It seems incomprehensible to me that my son was killed in the largest non-nuclear explosion in history. In addition to losing our son, we lost our home, our belongings, our future, and our sense of security. I suffer anxiety and flashbacks. Loud sounds leave me paralyzed in fear, and the sounds of children squealing bring back the blood-curdling screams that filled the hospital that night. A quiet moment brings to mind the last image of Isaac's face, scared and confused. I now have my newborn son, Ethan, who is now 8 months old, and I despair at the fact that his introduction to the world has been dominated not by joy, but by grief, and he will never get to meet his amazing older brother. The death of a child, regardless of how it happens, also brings with it an enormous amount of guilt. My husband and I have questioned every single little thing we did in the aftermath of the explosion, as well as every decision that we took, big and small, that led up to that day. I repeatedly asked myself, why did I take up my job at the United Nations? Why did we pick that apartment? Why did we put his high chair in that part of the room? Why, when the blast occurred, was I standing next to Isaac and not in front of him where my body could have shielded his? But these and many more decisions I question should not have been life and death decisions. I shouldn't have been put in a position where I feel guilty about the fact that if I had been standing one step to the right, my son might be here today. I can tell you what were life and death decisions. The decision on behalf of multiple authorities to do nothing about the ammonium nitrate stored unsafely in a residential area, despite clear warnings that it posed a threat to the city. The decision authorities took not to warn the people of Beirut of the danger when the fire at the port broke out. A simple warning to stay away from windows could have saved countless lives, including Isaac's. And the decision after the explosion not to provide guidance to the population on which hospitals were destroyed and which could accept patients, meaning people wasted precious minutes and hours trying to seek medical care. These were life and death decisions taken on behalf of the authorities, and in each case they willfully made the wrong one, knowing that they were putting innocent lives at risk. People have called the explosion an accident. My husband and I say that Isaac was murdered because negligence on this scale is absolutely criminal. After the explosion, I felt so defeated, so beaten down that I could not see a path to justice. I recall telling my husband in those early days that we will never see justice for Isaac, so it is probably not worth fighting for. How do you even begin to hope that those with power and resources to cover their tracks will be held accountable? I knew decades of United Nations reporting has shown that the Lebanese justice system lacks independence, is inefficient, lacks the necessary resources, and is weak to corrupt practices. Why should I expect that to change now, particularly when it is well known that senior officials, all the way up to the president, knew that the ammonium nitrate was there and that it posed a threat to the city? While initially I felt that the fight for justice was pointless, over time I've come to realize that if I don't take up this fight, it is essentially saying that what happened to Isaac and to 3-year-old Alexandra and 15-year-old Elias and all the other victims doesn't matter, and that their lives had no value. My son loved life. To watch the world through his eyes was pure joy. Yet one of his last sights in this world before he lost consciousness was of me, his mother, the person he always turned to for comfort, drenched in blood, glass embedded in my face, screaming for help. His last feeling in this world was of intense pain, and make no mistake, Isaac died a painful death. And that is not okay. What happened to Isaac is not right. He deserved more from this world, and if we did not fight for justice, we are essentially saying that what happened to this 2-year-old innocent child being brutally killed in his own home doesn't matter. But it does matter. I want those responsible for his death to know his name, to know his face, and I hope what happened to him haunts their dreams. Now, unfortunately, my fears about the Lebanese justice system are bearing fruit. We've all seen the delays, the due process violations, the political leaders' attempts to stop the investigation, and other political interference. Nearly a year on from Isaac's death, we are no closer to answers, let alone justice. It is for this reason that I believe an independent and impartial fact-finding mission via the Human Rights Council is the only way forward. Now, having worked for the International Criminal Court and the United Nations myself, I know that the international system of justice has its flaws and challenges. But I also know that when there is a political will and when members of the international community work together, positive changes as well as justice and accountability can be achieved. So my question to the international community is this: are you going to confirm my initial fears that there is no path to justice for my son? Or are you going to recognize that his life had value and that he deserved a chance at life and that was taken from him, not by accident, but by criminal negligence? Are you going to stand up and say what happened to him and all the other victims was wrong and that they deserve justice? In this regard, I'm calling on member states of the UN Human Rights Council to support the pursuit of justice by adopting a resolution establishing an independent and impartial fact-finding mission. And I'm also urging the Australian government, Isaac's home country, to take up the case of justice on Isaac's behalf and to use what means it has to ensure that such a resolution comes to being. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Every time I listen to you speak, Sarah, I know why we are fighting for justice, a difficult and long road ahead, Sarah, but we are with you and we are not going to forget, and we will not allow what happened for you to feel the guilt. We need to transfer that guilt to those who are responsible for what happened and not the parents of the children who are already suffering so much. That's what I was thinking about when I was listening to you talk, Sarah. And also, let's remind ourselves of what Sarah said. This at the very last moment, had there even been a warning, that area could have been cleared and Isaac would be here in Sarah's arms today. Let us not forget that. Thank you so much, Sarah. Please put any questions you have. Thank you. Please put any questions you have in the chat box, because there will be an opportunity to come back to our panelists and ask them questions. So do put your questions there, because we won't have so much time. I now want to move on to Nadine Labaki. As I mentioned, director, actress, activist. We are so pleased that you're with us. Look, Nadine, I'm sure there's so many calls on your time. And what I wanted to ask you is, Nadine, why was it important for you to be here today? What did you want to tell everybody? Over to you, and a very warm welcome.
I just want to thank you, first of all, for including me in this conversation. After hearing Sarah's words, I don't know what words or what actions could eventually erase, all the pain, especially when she was talking about Isaac's last thing that he saw. I don't know what can erase really the pain, but I think it's our duty. It's also my duty to at least try and do something. That every time any catastrophe happens in Lebanon, no matter how big or small it is, no matter if it's an assassination or an explosion or any terrorist attack, we've always been left wondering, and we've always been trying to guess, who did it this time. And we've always had so many enemies, and there are so many different possibilities. We have become sort of masters of speculations and conspiracy theories, and No local investigation has ever really been able to elucidate any of the assassinations or terrorist attacks during the past 30 years, especially with, you know, this, like you said, this culture of impunity and that the government officials have always enjoyed so much until now. And even, you know, concerning the port of Beirut explosion. Hello?
We can hear you, Nadine. I don't know what that was.
Okay, and like I said, even in the Beirut port explosion, you know, the government has gone, like you said, to the extent of issuing state immunity to the government's officials involved, so they cannot be questioned. And we have been surrounded by so many you know, enemies, so many countries that have so many reasons for this country to go to pieces, and we are surrounded by so many beasts, and we have always been vessels for other beasts' conflicts. But with everything that has been happening until now, I've come to the conclusion that our scariest and our most ferocious beast is actually our own government. We know, I mean, needless to say, that we are ruled by the most incompetent, corrupt, Machiavellic, negligent, disgusting political class. We know that every one of our government officials now who knew and didn't do anything about it are guilty. They all have the blood of the 200 victims and the 7,000 wounded on their hands. So it's only common sense to say that they are all criminals. What happened in Beirut was not, you know, it was not just another natural disaster. It wasn't just an accident like some people want us to believe. It was a man-made disaster, and it could have been avoided. And whether it was an attack or whether it was the result of the negligence of our ruling class, you cannot store 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate in the heart of a very populated area and not be held accountable. We cannot deny the absolute guilt of every person who knew. And I don't know how we are expected to neglect the fact that our own president bluntly said that he knew, but he had no power over it, that our own Minister of Interior proudly said that they will be able to elucidate the matter and hold the right people accountable within 5 days after the explosion. I don't know how we are expected to stay silent when we still don't have any answers concerning the hundreds of people who heard airplanes just before the explosion. Why was the fire department sent on site when so many officials knew about the hazardous nature of the fire? Why was there no warning of any sort while the fire was happening? Why was there no attempt whatsoever to clear out the area, especially that there was enough time to avoid many casualties? What happened to the dozens of reports and letters that were sent prior to the explosion in 2015, 2014, 15, 16, 17, and 18? Why was the Prime Minister's visit to the port prior to the explosion cancelled? Why was the public never warned when the fire was reported, and that there was no attempt to evacuate the area when they had plenty of time? There are so many more questions. What happened to the investigations following the several assassinations that were related to the port after the explosion? And what happened to the 50 requests made to the Lebanese government for an independent investigation sent from several organizations, and also the individual petition that were signed by over 10,000 people? So all these questions and so much more need to be answered. Knowing all these facts, do we really expect that the Lebanese government and the justice system will provide us with a fair investigation? I think an 8-year-old would be able to tell us that an objective, independent, fact-finding investigation is the only solution to be able to give us answers. We all deserve to know the truth. Azak's mom deserves to know what happened to her son and why, and who murdered her son. Elia's family and friends also deserve to know the truth. Alexander's parents deserve, everybody deserves the truth. Everybody deserves, we are all entitled to the truth. What happened in Beirut is a crime against humanity. What happened in Beirut is the most powerful non-nuclear explosion in history. So imagine a nuclear bomb happening somewhere else in the world. What would have happened? What happened should be the concern of every human being searching for justice. Or is it because it's happening in the Middle East and that it is still so sterile? Because for most of the people, this is just another day in the Middle East. No, this is not just another day in the Middle East. The Lebanese need to know the truth. We cannot be begging for the truth. We cannot be doomed for injustice. The whole world should be taking a stand with us. You know, Benjamin Franklin once said, justice will not be served until those who are not affected are as outraged as the ones who are. Well, we are still waiting for the world to be outraged with us. Unfortunately, some foreign governments and countries are shying away from addressing the question, saying that it should come from the Lebanese people themselves, but it's only common sense to admit that the Lebanese people with such an incompetent ruling class will not be able to make it on their own. We need the international community to keep the pressure. If the world continues to be silent, it is considered a failure to assist the whole population in danger. What can we do on an individual level? We can do a lot. People with dual nationality should be writing letters to their respective embassies requesting the UN Human Rights Council resolution to establish an independent fact-finding investigation. Individuals all over the world, not necessarily Lebanese, but who are concerned about this injustice should be lobbying, writing to their governments, their parliaments, requesting the same. It has to come from both ways, from the Lebanese themselves and from the international community. Any kind of reform is impossible if we don't know the truth. Any dream of building a country is impossible if we don't know the truth. We can be powerless in preventing injustice, but we have all the power to protest against it. If we don't do anything this time, we would be telling a whole generation that we are doomed for injustice. It's not a political battle. This is an ethical and moral battle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadine. It was fantastic to hear your words. And I was just thinking about them, you know, we're waiting for the world to be outraged because this is not every day how it should be in the Middle East. It's because it's Lebanon that we must not take action. Indeed, it's the opposite. We have the power to take action if we all come together, individuals, organizations. You reminded us, thank you, that more than 50 organizations and UN independent experts, special rapporteurs, international NGOs, national NGOs have signed up and requesting for an independent investigation. And we need to be supporting that. You remind us all to take a call to action. So let's think about that during this panel. There's a great deal that can be undertaken if we move together. The victims have been asking for the truth. They've been asking for acknowledgement, apologies, and thirdly, accountability. And that's also why we're here today. There's those three asks that we keep hearing. Thank you so much, Nadine. Now I want to move on to the friends of Elias Houri. And I'm going to read out all of their names, and we're so pleased that you could join us today. We have Yorgo, Alan, Shadi, Eves, Mario, Tarek, Christopher, Lucas, and Cyril, friends of Elias Houri, who lost his life 15 years old in the explosion last year. We're going to first of all see a very short video. I think it's just about 2 minutes, and then we're going to come to hear from his friends. So we'll just watch the video. Thank you. When I see you again, when I see you again. How do I breathe without you? Feeling so cold. I'll be waiting right here for you till the day you're home. Carry on. Give me all the strength I need.
been a long day without you, my friend, and I'll tell you all about it when I see you again. We've come a long way from where we began. Oh, I'll tell you all about it when I see you again. When I see you again. When I see you again, see you again. When I see you again.
Boys, thank you for that. It was a wonderful video. For those who don't know Elias, to have met him through that. I'm sure his mother here, Mireille, is with us. I'd like to hand over now to Yorgo and Mario.
I would like first to start by thanking LAW and the Human Rights Watch for hosting this event. And as already mentioned by Antonia, we are Elias for his friends. On August 4, we were on a group chat with Elias when he told us that he could see a fire from the Beirut port from his room. I live in the northern suburb of Beirut and I could see the port from my balcony. Seconds after my chat with Elias, the blast shook our house and our souls, and we lost contact with Elias. We all tried to call him, but his phone was out of service. I can never forget the orange mushroom cloud and the destruction that reached all the suburbs of Beirut, including ours. To this day, I have flashbacks of the destruction before my eyes. Ever since then, my friends and I have been traumatized by what we have witnessed. We first thought that Beirut was being bombed by fighter jets. The sound was terrifying. The earth shook under our feet. The first scenes on TV were horrible. Injured people, blood everywhere, people screaming for help, and death. We were all shocked, and it took us a while to realize what happened. We started calling the Khouris family to check on them. And then we knew that Elias had been injured and has been urgently transported to the hospital. We first thought that it might have been a mild injury and his phone is broken. We never thought that this would be our last chat with Elias. We never thought that this will be the last time we hear his voice. That we will never see his shining face again. That night was horrible. Nobody slept. We have been told that Elias had a severe injury in his head and he is having a brain surgery. We first thought he has been injured by the scattered glass and that he will be okay with some scars. Then the news started spreading that his situation is critical and he needs blood. We first started praying and established a chain of social media for blood donation, since he needs blood. Elias was losing blood due to excessive brain bleeding. We were ready to do anything to save Elias. We started group prayers, a daily mass along with more of our friends, with teachers and schoolmates. We had faith that Elias will make it. 14 days? Yes, Elias fought for 14 days. We used to record our voices every day and send them to him, to the ICU, to tell him that we are waiting for him and that he will get better.
On August 18, Elias succumbed to his wounds and broke our hearts. Since that day, we've had anger in our hearts and anger at the injustice that not only caused Elias's death, but the ambiguity behind it. We are angry at the lack of responsibility and the guilt at the hands of the government. We are angry because Elias has fallen victim to a fallen and corrupt criminal state. We wanted to graduate together, to live peacefully and fulfill our dreams. We wanted to carry Elias because he succeeded in school and university. We wanted to carry Elias on his wedding day. Instead, we carried his coffin on our shoulders and we carried him through the school he grew up in. Instead of making memories, building relationships, and preparing for our futures, we carried our friend for one last time through his second home. The grief was and still is heavy for our young souls that shouldn't have been burdened with such a tragedy. In a few days, we grew up 10 years. Why? Why did we as teens ended up experiencing something horrible? Something that in decent countries brings governments down and shakes the conscience of the world. 10 months have passed and we still don't know what happened to our friend or why it happened. We do not trust the local authorities. The national investigation has been dragging for 10 months and will never reveal the truth. We do believe that only an international investigation committee can answer our question: who killed Ilyas? Ilyas became the symbol for convincing our generation that Lebanon is not a country worth living in. Today, if you ask us what would you like to say to Ilyas, the answer would be, Ilyas, our brother, we miss you a lot. We will never forget you. You will remain in our hearts and minds forever. We will fulfill your dreams and promise that you will be with us in every step we make. We will always hear your songs and listen to your voice. Your loss changed our lives forever. We are more responsible and more aware. We will do things for you. We will carry you in our hearts throughout our journeys. Ilyas, you are a hero, our guardian angel and our source of strength. We will never stop seeking justice for you and all the victims of the 4th of August. Ilyas, we love you. Thank you for listening to us.
Thank you, boys. Thank you so much for joining us a day where you should be in school, and here you are talking about what happened to your dear friend Elias. We will not forget, and we were going to keep fighting for justice from him. And I thought the words when you said that it's a symbol of a generation that Lebanon is not worth living in. And we have to change that, because that cannot be the future of young people in Lebanon. So we need to work with you to act for change. Again, you're so brave to come forward. And I just want to, before I hand over to Ayman Mahana, say that we brought out a report last November in relation to the root causes of the explosion. And when we asked to have victims' witnesses' statements, we only had 9 people that came forward to give those statements, because they are so fearful of giving statements in the current situation of Lebanon, even though we redacted their names. It just shows that it's bravery of you boys to come forward, and also really the difficult situation that we are dealing with. And on that note, I want to hand over to Ayman Mahana, who's the Executive Director of the Samir Kassir Foundation. Ayman, your foundation, and the name of it, is from a journalist that was assassinated in 2005, and there was a string of assassinations. I wonder if you can tell us today and talk about whether justice has been served from those assassinations, and what do you see moving forward? What do the Lebanese people want? Can you share us some thoughts with us today? And a warm welcome to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Antonia. When I look at the faces and the names of the people present with us on this Zoom call, I see, of course, friends, I see diplomats, I see Sarah, the friends of Elias, Mireille, I see journalists, civil society activists, I see diplomats from different embassies. There is one shameful, criminal, and arrogant absence. I hope they were not invited, but at the same time, they knew this event is public. The rulers of Lebanon, the government of Lebanon, public officials of Lebanon, their absence is a sign of disdain, of continued disdain. But actually, we would be naive to be surprised. When we say they are murderers, it's not only a reaction to what happened in the port. They are literally murderers and responsible for tens of thousands of deaths, at least from 1975 to 1990. And they gave themselves amnesty for their crimes, and they are still in power. So they actually acknowledged that they were murderers and just gave themselves amnesty. That's what happened. This is what happened in 1991, and they're still in power. And they attracted to them other parties who may have joined the government since, who, even if they were not engaged in the civil war, in killing in the civil war, are responsible for all the tragedies that happened after the civil war, with always the same culture of impunity. So you ask about Samir Kassir. Samir is one of 30 journalists and media development and media professionals who were killed in Lebanon since the independence of the country. Absolutely no one was held ever accountable. Only the person who shot at journalist Kamel Mrouwa in 1966, only that person was brought to justice, but not the people behind the assassination, not the people who gave the order. that person was sentenced to 20 years in jail. And in 1976, when the prison where he was staying was stormed by militias that were sympathetic to those who gave the order, he was freed and he moved to Lugano in Switzerland, got married, and just continued his life there alongside many other killers. So this is the only case in Lebanon where someone was brought to justice to be released just a few years later to spend their life, calmly in Lugano on the beautiful lake of Switzerland. So this is the culture of total impunity that made it possible for many other journalists, many other politicians, many other thought leaders to be killed. We are, discussing this situation today, just a few months after Luqman Slim's assassination, which was made possible because none of the previous assassinations were investigated properly. And there are also other killings that took place in the recent few months. Antoine Daher, Mr. Bejani, and also other assassinations motivated by personal disputes. So it is a rule in Lebanon. Whenever a petty crime takes place for, personal dispute between two people, our justice system is probably one of the most advanced when it comes to resolving these crimes. Anytime, however, that there is any kind of potential political connection to the crime, this is when our justice system, our law enforcement organizations completely lose their effectiveness, their efficiency, and just maintain this culture of impunity. And the culture of impunity is not only related to assassinations or terrorism or crimes of the size and scale of the Beirut 2020 blast. It trickles down to every single level. Impunity also prevails when it comes to corruption. Impunity also prevails when it comes to mismanagement of public funds. It also prevails when it comes to conflict of interest, because every perpetrator of, in quotation marks, a small crime justifies his crime, and I'm on purpose not using a gender neutral pronoun. He justifies his crime by saying that, why are you holding me accountable while the perpetrators of bigger crimes, while the bigger fish is still roaming free? So as long as we maintain this culture of impunity, it will trickle down to every single wrongdoing. It will trickle down to even citizens when it comes to respecting traffic law. We will only be able to enforce traffic law in Lebanon once we set accountability as a rule rather than impunity as a rule. And then there is another way that impunity keeps prevailing in Lebanon. It's through the very deliberate policy of no policy that our rulers have adopted. It is true that they are incompetent. It's true that they are corrupt, but they know exactly that their lack of action will lead to the consequences they are hoping for. So this policy of no policy is deliberate because they are playing on people's, despair, on the need to move on this so-called resilience that in fact in Lebanon has just meant putting up with the worst rulers ever and moving on. So they deliberately choose to wait, to procrastinate, and it is part of their defense mechanism to protect their very impunity. So today, can it change? Is there social demand for justice? Yes. Is there social demand for a more independent fact-finding mission or investigation? Absolutely. It is growing. We're feeling it on the street, but we're also feeling it among lawyers, within the Bar Association. We're feeling it among students who are overwhelmingly saying no to the old way of doing politics. We're feeling it recently in the Orders of Engineers election. These are small signs. We're also feeling it, most importantly, among the families of victims. However, what they are up against, is not only a criminal, corrupt political class. They're also up against apathy. They're also up against despair that is growing because of the economic and social crisis. Because many people confronted with all the difficulties would rather just get their, $10 rather from the bank that looted them, rather than caring about other things. And this is the strategy of the rulers, making us only care about the mundane, daily economic and social priorities in order to avoid demanding accountability. And their second technique to also prevent accountability is to reignite the sectarian fears, the community fears, as if you hold accountable the prime minister, suddenly that person needs to run to the mufti to protect himself under his robe, literally. When you demand accountability for the governor of the central bank, he has to run to the patriarch and request religious blessing as a community-based system of impunity to protect the rulers and to maintain the status quo. And if you ask for accountability for those who assassinated political leaders, they will turn it into a sectarian issue. This is their way. This is our rulers' way of surviving. And we must say it as it is. This is bullshit, and we're not accepting it anymore. So yes, for a fact-finding mission, but it must not be an orphan institution, an orphan initiative, a one-off. It needs to be placed in an ecosystem that will support it. It requires political will to support it long-term, because it might take time. It requires political will to enforce sanctions on those who do not cooperate. It requires political will to take action based on the findings, after the findings. But it also needs a local fertile ground of lawyers, of judges that are committed to maintaining the pressure, regardless of who's appointed prosecutor general, who's appointed investigator. Their voice must be heard louder than ever. It's also coming from the families of victims who not only need our support in speeches and conferences, but they might need economic support. They might need psychosocial support. We all need to be there for them. And most importantly, and this is where I'll end with a field that is very close to the work of our foundation, they need an independent media sector that asks the right questions, that investigates properly. And this is something growing. This is something nascent, and we are here to support it alongside our partners. Today, I have more faith in whatever independent media organizations, independent journalists will reveal than what the Lebanese politically controlled judiciary will be even allowed to consider. So more than ever, accountability and the fight against impunity requires support for investigative journalism, requires support for holding accountable partners of Lebanon, donors of Lebanon who have supported our institutions for many years. And I'm really happy to see representatives of several of our partners. We just received notice that we will launch the largest ever follow the money investigation into the support that came to the Lebanese judiciary system and security apparatuses for the last 10 years to conduct a freedom of expression and human rights audit of that support. The money that came to support the tribunals under the pretext of fighting terrorism was also used to suppress independent voices. The money that came to help our ISF use bikes to develop community policing was important, but it also eluded so many wrongdoings by the ISF. The support for the army to protect the borders is also a support that protected wrongdoings vis-a-vis refugees and absolutely no role in stopping the smuggling that is today destroying the Lebanese economy. So it is time to speak truth to our friends and partners from the international community about the actual impact of their tolerance to wrongdoings in Lebanon. There is a disaster and risk management unit at the Grand Serai with a huge fund from UNDP that was signed in 2013. It is sitting there. They tried their best probably after the blast, but they were given absolutely no clout to deal with our response units, to deal with anything, to call for the evacuation. However, they have been sitting here for many years getting decent salaries. It is up to us to ask, what have you been doing with that international taxpayers' money if we're not feeling the impact? And this is also part of the accountability, and we are engaged in it. So this is something that requires accountability at every level because it's a system, it's a house of cards. And I have full faith that the moment we will be able to hold accountable one perpetrator, whether for killing the people on August 4th, or for stealing the money of international aid, or for using support for the justice or the security service in order to spy on citizens and to build up fake cases such as what happened with Ziad Aitani. The moment we get one piece of that system accountable, it's the entire house of cards that will collapse. And this is our aim. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ayman, for that impassioned speech and also for some really concrete and solid recommendations as well. Just before we hand over to our next panelist, I just wanted to bring up one comment that you made. We work with and advise and represent thousands of victims from conflict countries across the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. And one thing that they always say to us is we can't fight for justice where we can barely live day to day. And I think this resonated when I heard you speaking about the current situation in Lebanon and also the difficulties we face when we speak also with member states, because the situation in Lebanon is deteriorating, the economic situation is deteriorating, but it doesn't mean that people don't want justice and accountability. But if they can barely survive, and we have 70% of the population now below the poverty line, it's going to be very difficult for them. And as you said, there can be a policy of no policy, and this idea that the Lebanese are resilient and they will continue. But no, it is now changed. Thank you so much, Ayman. And let's go on now to Lynn Malouf, who's the Middle East Research Director. We heard from Ayman that there hasn't been accountability for the assassinations, but Lynn, could you, and that's going back, decades, but Lynn, could you give us a comment on generally the situation in Lebanon? Has there been redress, legal redress for human rights abuses and violations? And what's your opinion of civil society's desire for accountability? And thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you very much, Antonia, and thank you everyone who spoke before me. I will dive right into to respond to your question, Antonia. First of all, let me start with a disclaimer. I am here speaking to you today as a representative of Amnesty International, mainly to set out the legal framework that underpins our partners' call to the Human Rights Council to step in. But I am also here as a 47-year-old Lebanese who has been exposed to violence since childhood, be it from the 15-year armed conflict that started in 1975 to the successive chapters that ensued in Lebanon's long history of violence. And I lived through this blast. And like everyone else around me, I have not moved on, nor will I be able to move on without facts that are established, and more importantly, responsibilities that are attributed and identified for what has come. And I think that's clearly coming out from all of the panelists' interventions before me. This blast has come to epitomize the culmination of decades of impunity that has today pervaded every aspect of our lives, like Ayman has so brilliantly expressed. Since 1975 to this day, there has been no comprehensive justice or meaningful justice for the people in Lebanon, not for the decades of armed conflict, nor for the subsequent episodes of violence that continue to this day, the most recent being the killing of activist and thinker Lokman Slim. This past February, Lokman Slim was a driving force in civil society's post-war struggle against impunity. With this cataclysmic explosion, never before had the notion that individuals in decision-making powers, were aware of the risks and failed to take any measures. Never before had this notion been so cruel. And this is at the crux of our discussion today, how to determine responsibilities for the failure to protect the right to life of the population of an entire capital city. With this explosion, the clearest violation is at stake is the state's failure to protect the right to life. The UN 2016 Minnesota Protocol, which aims to protect the right to life and advance justice, accountability, and the right to remedy, identifies a potentially unlawful death as occurring where the state may have failed to meet its obligations to protect life. This includes, for example, any situation where a state fails to exercise due diligence to protect an individual or individuals from foreseeable external threats or violence by non-state actors. In such case, States have an obligation to investigate what can be potentially unlawful death and ensure accountability and remedy violations. The duty to investigate, the protocol continues, is an essential part of upholding the right to life. A failure of investigation is in itself a breach of the right to life. And it further goes on to state that impunity stemming from, for example, unreasonably short statutes of limitations or blanket amnesties, or from prosecutorial inaction or political interference is incompatible with this duty. Having said this, the authorities, both legislative and decision makers, have already raised the argument of impunity during the course of the domestic investigation to date. In other words, they have been claiming that they are protected by law from prosecution for any responsibility in this blast. Among the systemic and procedural concerns tied to the ongoing domestic process, which have already been documented by Legal Agenda, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and others, the issue of impunity from prosecution for sitting officials is particularly disturbing, given that immunity and quasi-blanket amnesty have underpinned Lebanon's transition from the 15-year conflict in 1990 to this day, and that have effectively shut out any space for victims and survivors to seek redress. When the first investigative judge issued charges of criminal negligence against acting prime minister and 3 former ministers, 2 of whom are members of parliament, these 2 requested the judge's dismissal, arguing that they enjoyed parliamentary immunity. They were referring to the Lebanese constitution in its articles 3940, which states that immunity, parliamentary immunity from criminal arrest or prosecution, extends to all current members of parliament, except in cases where the person is caught in the commission of the crime, and that immunity can only be lifted by a vote of the parliament itself. The Court of Cassation, the judiciary's highest court, decided to remove the judge. The second judge was appointed following sustained mobilization by the victims. But just earlier this month, the new judge, in a rare update he provided to the media, again referred to the immunity of sitting members of parliament as the exception to holding all those who failed to act, ignored, or was complicit in the blast. This is only one issue among the concerns that we have documented, which I just mentioned, which are the inherent but also the procedural flaws with the ongoing investigation. But I did zoom in on this point as it is indicative of where the state stands in its willingness to ensure justice. Whether immunity is applicable or not, the very fact that it is being claimed to shield officials from prosecutions and being stamped by the highest judicial authority should put any expectations for a meaningful domestic process to rest. A full range of other rights have additionally been impacted by the explosion. Indeed, the blast has led to a failure to ensure protection not only of the right to life, but also to health, housing, food, water, education, and to a healthy environment. All these issues have not come only out of the blast aftermath. They preceded it, indeed, were the drivers for the October 17 protest movement, and today are driving an entire population 6 feet underground in the face of continuing inaction on behalf of the state and the lack of will or ability to initiate any vital reforms. That is also, and primarily, why the explosion cannot be viewed as an isolated incident, why it has come to symbolize the state's ultimate failure to protect the most basic right of all, right to life. And why our call today for an international-led process is grounded in a continuing pattern of impunity in Lebanon and sits squarely within the struggle against the overarching culture of impunity. In Lebanon, the arc of history does not bend towards justice. not to date at least. And if we are here today, over 50 organizations and survivors and victims turning to the Human Rights Council, it is based on the premise that the domestic judiciary investigation cannot deliver on an effective, transparent, and independent investigation, which is exactly what the UN Special Rapporteurs called for last year, and which alone can ensure a meaningful process that seeks to provide redress through establishing facts, responsibilities, and holding those responsible to account. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I think you perfectly placed and highlighted the total lack of accountability. And please do forgive me. I believe that I may have said that you are the Middle East Research Director at Human Rights Watch. If I did, I'm so sorry, everybody. To clarify, Lynn is with Amnesty International. I do apologize if I did that. Sorry for that. And thank you for reminding us of this issue of immunity and that this has been claimed and it remains in place. And this is of grave concern. And we heard Ayman also referring earlier to the 1991 amnesty law, which of course is from the 1975 to 1990 civil wars, which also has allowed no one to be held accountable. And as Lynn has said, this is not isolated, but she said it's the state's ultimate failure to protect the right to life. I want to go on now to our last speaker, so Lama Fakif, who's the Crisis and Conflict Director at Human Rights Watch. So you're our last speaker. We've heard it very clearly set out the failures of the Lebanese justice system, but can you explain to us why Human Rights Council investigation, how would it work? What would it deliver? How could it deliver justice and serve both the needs of the Lebanese population, what they're asking for, and the victims? Welcome, Lama. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonia. And I also want to thank all of the panelists for your interventions. It is really your stories and your strength and your expertise that gives me hope that we will be successful in this fight. To answer your question, Antonia, a Human Rights Council investigation would do no less than telling a mother who was responsible for the death of her child. It would create a more credible pathway to justice for the victims of the blast, and it would end the reign of impunity that has for too long cast its shadow over victims of human rights abuse in the country. Impunity, like corruption, doesn't just affect those that are its immediate victims. Both create a culture that plagues society. And both are central features to the collapse that Lebanon is experiencing today. We are calling on the Human Rights Council to adopt a resolution to establish an investigative mechanism, like a one-year fact-finding mission into the blast. This mechanism would investigate if there have been violations of the right to life and the other rights that Lynn helpfully outlined in her remarks. And it would make recommendations on how to ensure that this kind of disaster can never happen again. But an investigation into the blast is not just about August 4th. We experienced the manifestations of corruption and impunity that led to the August 4 blast every day in Lebanon. We experience it in 22-hour electricity cuts and in 2-hour lines at the gas station. We experience it when we go to the pharmacy and cannot get the medication we need. And when we go to the grocery store and spend more than a month's salary on a bag of groceries. August 4 plagues us. It is the tragedy and the trauma of that day that we carry with us, that we will always carry. But it is in the everyday trauma of living in a country where the political class is not accountable to the people and to the responsibilities that they shoulder. So what can an HRC investigation accomplish? It can establish the truth. It can determine the facts and circumstances that led to the purchase and shipment of the ammonium nitrate to Beirut. The facts around how such a huge quantity of highly combustible and potentially explosive material came to be stored in Beirut's port for years, a mere 480 meters away from a residential area, and can establish whether anyone had access to this material during that time. It can determine what triggered the explosion at Beirut's port on August 4, and the role that corruption at the port played in contributing to the explosion. These are questions for which we do not have answers. Answering the what of the events surrounding the explosion is as important as identifying the who. Who are the middle and senior level officials who knew about the existence of the ammonium nitrate, who had a responsibility to act to secure it, and who failed to do so? For far too long, the Lebanese public has been denied the truth about who is responsible for grave abuses against them. And we heard this quite clearly from Ayman. And we know that the truth is essential for any kind of accountability. The long-term goal of such investigative bodies is to gather and preserve evidence that can be used to push for criminal accountability through the domestic judiciary, or that can serve as evidence for cases tried in other states that have jurisdiction. For example, in cases where nationals of other countries may have been impacted by the blast. There are currently at least 2 such prosecutions, one in France and one in Germany. Without an HRC investigation, these countries will rely on the flawed investigation being conducted in Lebanon, which, as we've heard, will not look into the role of senior officials due to the legal immunity that they enjoy. While criminal accountability in Lebanon may not apply to these senior officials, foreign prosecutions are not bound by these archaic immunity laws. If found guilty in foreign courts, senior officials could face international arrest warrants. Even if such evidence is not used immediately for prosecutions, it is essential that the evidence is gathered as soon as possible before it is lost. The findings of such investigative bodies can also be used to push for targeted human rights and corruption sanctions against those found responsible for the blast. Lebanese leaders may escape accountability in domestic courts, but the international community does have other tools to signal to officials that there will be costs to their abuses. For too long, officials have been ambivalent to the suffering of ordinary Lebanese, but they will not be ambivalent to targeted sanctions that target their personal wealth. UN-mandated investigations are increasingly being used to respond to serious violations of human rights, like the types that Lynn outlined, whether these are the result of protracted or sudden events. And they are being used to promote accountability and counter impunity. We require one country or a group of countries to step forward to author or sponsor a resolution. The resolution could request cooperation from other UN bodies and member states with the fact-finding mission to provide administrative, technical, and logistical assistance, as well as any information such as investigative reports that were conducted in the aftermath of the blast. The resolution should call on Lebanon to cooperate fully with the fact-finding mission and to facilitate its access to evidence. But the HRC can establish a fact-finding mission even without the consent of the Lebanese state. The international community has invested heavily in Lebanon's state institutions, and in Lebanon's democracy. But that investment is undercut. It is undermined every day that corruption and impunity are allowed to flourish. As the Prime Minister aptly said in his resignation speech, in Lebanon, corruption is bigger than the state. We experienced the meaning of that on August 4. And if we do not address the underlying causes of the blast, we have no way to protect against a similar tragedy unfolding again in the future. It is time for the Human Rights Council to step in, to heed the calls of the families of the victims and of Lebanese people for accountability, rule of law, and protection of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lama. I think you perfectly set out the reasons why we're calling for a UN Human Rights Council investigation, what would be required and what would be the benefit of it. Now, thank you so much. We only have 10 minutes left. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come to each panelist and ask them for their final remarks. I would please ask you no more than 2 minutes. And I'm going to just set out a couple of the questions that have been put in the chat box that I'd like to ask some of you to consider in your remarks. And I'll be coming to Ambassador Kindle first, and then Nadine, then Ayman, Lynn, and then Lama. Now, some of the questions that we've heard is that this might be in particular for the ambassador, Nadine, and Ayman. If there is not the political will for a Human Rights Council resolution, what other options do we have? Would it be, what could be undertaken? What do you recommend? So we'd like to hear from you. And the other questions that we have as well, for maybe for Lama and for Lynn, and to some extent you've answered it though, has it been too long for a fact-finding mission? There's been a lot of concern about the destruction of evidence. Also, could you talk about whether it can be, can there be an investigation that would be totally independent from the Lebanese government? And can an investigation be carried out by your investigators if they don't have the cooperation of the government or access to the country? Questions that are frequently asked in relation to a UN investigation. So I just ask you to bear those questions in mind as you give your final comments to the panel. And I would like to go first to Ambassador Kindle. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antonia, and big thank you to everyone on the panel for their contributions. I'll be honest with you on the international investigation, because I have been struggling with it for quite some time. I have a strong interest in shedding light on what happened in the port, because a colleague of mine was killed, and for many other reasons. I have, as a government representative, I have an acute sense of the necessity of sovereignty of another state. So it is not easy for me to say, of course, there needs to be an international investigation, because there is a national investigation. And as I said in the beginning, it's I'm not in a position, we have a very slow judicial system ourselves. I'm not in a position to criticize the lack of speed and the lack of seriousness or potential lack of seriousness of this investigation, because I don't have the details. I personally find that I would be willing to wait for the end, if it comes by the end of this year, the end of this investigation. As Tariq Bitar told me, he's planning to finish by the end of this year. I have a strong interest to make clear in the end what went wrong with this investigation, because it's obvious that many things went wrong. And therefore, I can see a big advantage in having an international monitoring mechanism or instrument into looking into this national investigation, because it's very obvious that many of the things went wrong. Not sure we can we can serve this interest best by setting up an international investigation right now. I'm not sure, but I'm ready to continue these talks, because I have a personal interest and want to defend this towards Berlin and Brussels, that this investigation comes to the bottom of it. There is a lot of instruments we can use, and I've heard some of you speaking about sanctions. I'm a big fan of sanctions. I've been working on sanctions for 7 years, and I think it's a valuable instrument. I think it's completely adequate and appropriate in this case. And I can tell you that we are working on sanctions, on the legal details right at the moment in Brussels. Not hiding from you that there's no consensus at the moment on the details. There are member states of the European Union who are hesitant or even negative, but there is movement. I can see this because everyone is not convinced and frustrated by what's going on. So I don't have an answer to this. I think there needs to be a complementary toolbox with all those issues. I would prefer to be sanctions a priority or one of the priorities. If I just can thank by concluding Ayman and Lynn for mentioning Lokman Slim, who was a friend. And I really have also there a extremely strong interest, and I'm personally to help the investigation. I offered our support to the president and to the director of the police, but I want to say, of course, it was not accepted. There has to be a national investigation, of course. This offer of support is ongoing. So whenever there's anything we can do in this, really, I would love to help. But thank you to Ayman and Lynn for mentioning Lokman Slim in this respect. Thank you, Antonia, for organizing this event.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We're very grateful for your comments. And of course, we'll be coming back to you to follow up on some of the suggestions and next steps. I look forward to working with you. I'm going to come to Nadine Labaki to think outside the box, because you have the power of film, of documentary. Could media could utilize in some way? Love to hear your thoughts, Nadine. Any final comments?
I mean, yes, of course, absolutely. The media can be utilized in so many effective ways, to keep the pressure on, to keep the pressure going. And I've tried at some point, to do that small video with Kate Blanchett's, voiceover to mobilize a little bit more the international community to sort of maybe shed the light on the horrifying events and to just, for me, it was intended to be sort of a wake-up call, because what happened in Lebanon is, like I said, not just another accident or another disaster. It's truly a nuclear bomb happening. So I don't know if something like that would have happened in the States or in some other countries, what would have happened? I'm sure the whole world would be mobilized by now. And that's why I said, I'm waiting, and we're all waiting for the whole world to be outraged in the face of such a crime. So of course, media has to play a very big part. And I think also individual actions, like I said before, and also when I was talking to you, also this pressure on an individual level that we can keep putting by writing letters to our, for people who have dual nationalities, to write letters for their embassies, their respective embassies, for people from the international community who are not necessarily not concerned, who are concerned but not necessarily affected by the blast, but to keep the pressure, or any person who has an ounce of rage or anger or towards what's happening, and who has an ounce of humanity, should be keeping the pressure. And I think the pressure, instinctively, I don't have the tools. I'm not, I'm not a specialist in these things, but instinctively, I would say, keep the pressure this way. I mean, if every single one of us would write a letter to the UN or to the government, to the embassies, or, foreign people who are concerned, write letters to their parliaments or governments, or maybe things will change. Maybe we will be able to put pressure and ask for the UN Human Rights Council to to establish this this fact-finding independent mission. So I don't know. I don't really have the exact answers, but this is my instinctive take on it. And of course, the media has to play a big part.
Thank you so much, Nadine. We're really grateful for your support being here today. And I know I also want to thank you from the families who said that, to pass our thanks on to you. And we will not be the last time, Nadine, that we'll be calling on you for your support. So
whatever you need.
Recommendations. I want to move on to Ayman to give us final comments and also some ways forward.
Thank you. I definitely support what Ambassador Kindle said about sanctions. These criminals must be sanctioned. And however you swing your purse, your hand, your bag, you will hit an example of these people perpetrating a crime that deserves sanction. So there is no dearth of evidence on them at every single level. Second word is a word I know is contentious in the field of international development, conditionalities. And I don't want to, debate it from an ideological perspective. Today, the army, the security services, whether general security or ISF, and the justice sector are all engaged in support programs funded by our international partners. They need to understand that support must be linked to their commitment to rule of law principles, to human rights principles, to conducting investigations up to the end without political interference, without fear of political control, and that international taxpayers' money is not available for them just to conduct one program and tick the boxes while they're behaving badly on other fronts. This conversation is definitely needed. The third element is more investigative journalism, and not only investigative journalism that might appear in an international outlet, but we're talking here about making investigative journalism the new normal, accountability journalism, the new normal. And we're not only talking about very long pieces. Every time a reporter hands a microphone to a politician, it needs to be focused on accountability. And our organization, our foundation, is committed to building the capacity of journalists to do just that. But we also know that accountability journalism and investigative journalism are expensive and require time, require dedication, require resources. We are here to support that. Some investigations are already ongoing, and we're very happy to be supporting them, but more is needed. And we are here to support that, not only in terms of conducting the investigation, but also how to promote it locally and internationally, how to promote it on social media so that every single person who may not necessarily have access to daraj.com or Megaphone or Al Jadid would see it and would act upon it. But finally, if there is any chance for change in Lebanon, for accountability in Lebanon, this path is political. This path requires a critical number of independent, rule of law oriented lawmakers, politicians to be sitting inside parliament, inside the municipal councils, in order to denounce every act of corruption, every act of travesty of justice, looking at the budget of every single Ministry of Justice, every single court, every single security institutions, question them, leak the numbers to us, because you know how obscure and non-transparent is the work inside our parliamentary committees. Unless we have a critical number of parliamentarians inside to reveal these secrets and to help the investigation, to help the families of victims, it won't happen. Political change is key and center. This is why it requires clarity and a very strong platform about sovereignty of state institutions, accountability, good governance, freedoms, and human rights. This should be the platform of people who would bring about change. We need a comprehensive approach. Civil society, judiciary, media, our international partners, and people in parliament. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayman. A lot of excellent recommendations there for us to consider. I'm going to come to Lynn and to Lama. And when you just remind you of the earlier questions, but also if you can answer the question that Ambassador, well, he didn't put it as a question, but I'm going to put it as a question to you. He said he, understanding all the difficulties, but we would need to wait until the end of the current domestic investigation in order to move to an international one. Can you both, I'm going to ask you to comment in your 2 minutes why we can't wait, why we shouldn't wait. I'd be interested to have your thoughts. Thank you, Lynn.
I mean, my answer to this is, where is the investigation now into the killing of Luqman Slim? Where is the investigation now into the killing of Samir Asir, whose picture we see behind Ayman? Where are all of the investigations for all of the crimes that have taken place in this country since 1975 and onwards? The enforced disappearances were only met with a law acknowledging, recognizing the right of families to know what happened to their loved ones 30 years after the events. This is not okay. When our Minister of Justice, after the explosion, retracting her initial statement for an international investigation, says, let us give justice a chance. It is the Lebanese people who deserve a chance with justice. They never had that chance. They have only been exposed to selective justice processes that have not led to any change, that have led to flawed expectations. I think we already have the answers today, and justice delayed is justice denied. And that is why we put out our call before the end of the investigation. The judge a month ago told the media that his investigation would be finished within the course of 2 months. Now he is saying that it would be before the end of this year. And then what? Just to go back to some of the questions answered in terms of, is there still value today if there is a resolution passed in terms of actually conducting a fact-finding mission, of yielding results, of whether the Lebanese state, in case the Lebanese state does not approve of access to investigators to be able to come, would such a resolution or such a mechanism still be useful? Yes, and yes. As we know from examples from the group of eminent experts in Yemen, from the Commission of Inquiry on Syria, there have been fact-finding mechanisms established by the Human Rights Council that have not had access to the places where the violations have happened. And yet the value of the documentation, of bringing this documentation to the public fora, to the public arena, is enough in itself. And that is what we are asking for. And we do have, we do have precedents, as Lama had explained. Thank you, Antonio.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Indeed, I was on one of those UN investigations as a UN investigator with no access to a country on Myanmar, presenting a report. Thank you, Lynn. Lama, final comments.
Thank you, Antonia. And I will just add briefly to what Lynn has said. First, I will say I have a great respect for Ambassador Kindle, and I know that his commitment to justice and truth for the victims of the Beirut blast is an unwavering one. But I do believe that delaying the establishment of a fact-finding mission will only further corrode the evidence of the crimes that were perpetrated. For those that are in Lebanon, or that were in Lebanon around the time of the blast, you will remember that after the port explosion, there were 2 fires in the port in September. There were concerns that evidence was corroded then. There have also been allegations that some ministers have removed documents out of ministries. And while an investigation, can and should proceed even without the consent of the Lebanese government, there is, of course, every reason to try to encourage the government to cooperate with the investigation and to give access to those documents. We know from the work of investigative journalists and the work that we've done ourselves that quite a lot can still be gleaned even without access to the country. and with the additional resources that the HRC could bring to the table, with the cooperation of member states like the US government. The FBI conducted an investigation in the days following the port explosion. A lot more will be known about who was responsible and what transpired on August the 4th.
Thank you so much, Lama. And indeed, I concur that I'm so thankful for Ambassador Kindle coming to be on this panel. And I was curious to his question, which I thought was a very, very valid one. So that's why I was curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much. This brings us to the end of the panel, but not, of course, to our end, to the fight for justice. And it's a long road ahead, and I'm counting on all of you to support us with this partnership with Human Rights Watch. As we've heard, it is the Lebanese population that have been ultimately suffering, who are the long-term victims, and the victims, it is why we are here today. We've heard from them, from Sarah, and about Isaac. We heard from the friends of Elias. Thank you so much, boys. It means so much that you would join us today. Parents of Alexandra, who've been with us throughout this fight as well. We're not going to forget. Daily life will not be allowed to, the rigors of daily life must not overcome our ability to continue to struggle for justice, because that's what it is going to be, as Ayman had set out very clearly. We have many avenues and possibilities ahead of us. The Human Rights Council resolution is an important one, but we've also heard of many other avenues and suggestions here today. I'd like you to unmute your microphones to thank all of the panelists for their excellent participation, and all of you for joining us today. And my heart goes out in particular to the families of those who've lost their loved ones or have been injured. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, and I wish you all very well.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for
very
allowing
much.
me to participate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Great work. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Antonia. Thank you, Your Excellency. Bye. Thank you again.